It's great to welcome back to the program today Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th district, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. Congressman, always great to speak with you.
Always a pleasure, David.
There's so many things to talk about. Let's start with the United States Innovation and Competition Act of 2021, formerly known as the Endless Frontier Act. What's the goal here? What would this legislation do?
First of all, it would be a dramatic increase in science and technology funding of the kind we haven't seen since the Apollo years. We're at about 0.7% of GDP in science research. Comparatively, China has almost doubled, 1.3% of their GDP. This would add 250 billion, over 100 billion of that in science and technology development. And it would put this across the country. So focusing on Black communities, brown communities, rural communities, making sure innovation is accessible to places left behind.
When we look at something like that bill, and we look at the infrastructure proposal, and we look at all of these different big pieces of legislation that could be tackled, and we run into the inevitable questions about, okay, in the Senate, does it need 60 votes? And if not, can it be done with 50? But if it can be done with the 50, do Democrats have 50 or do they have 49 or 48? Is this just going to be the question around every piece of legislation for the foreseeable future?
It is. And look, unfortunately, we're living in a Senate which is 50-50. We thought we would do better. We didn't. We need to build on that majority. And we're living in a House that only has a 5-vote majority. So it is the challenge of governing with slim majorities. And it's the challenge of governing with a dysfunctional Senate, which has a filibuster rule that allows the minority, legitimizes obstruction.
I don't think you and I have talked about this. I mean, in terms of the filibuster, there are some who say just eliminate it, period, eliminate it altogether. And then those who say, but that's also a double-edged sword. There's these intermediate ideas of, well, instead of saying you need 60 to end debate, make it that you need 40 actual people to continue pushing it forward, and kind of like flip the onus around or require it to be a talking filibuster. What's your view about this issue?
My view is that we just need to end the filibuster.
End it
It has
altogether.
been used over and over again to suppress and obstruct civil rights legislation, racial equality legislation. In fact, that's been its primary use. And it was an invention of Calhoun, who wanted to give slave states the power to block
Yep.
progressive legislation. But I'm for anything that will advance the ball. So if we're going to say, okay, we want to have voting rights be an exception to the filibuster, I'm for that. If we're going to put the onus on senators to actually speak and show up, and that's going to make it much harder to filibuster, I'm for that. But ultimately, we need to do away with this. It's not part of our Constitution. It's not part of our founders' vision.
Do you worry about the argument that it's a double-edged sword and it could really come back and hurt Democrats when the political circumstances and the division are just slightly different?
For two reasons, I don't. First, the Republicans push their agenda through anyway. That's how they got the Donald Trump tax cut. So a lot of the Republican agenda of let's cut taxes, let's slash government, isn't subject to the filibuster. It's a lot of our policies that are subject to the filibuster. Second, in a country, I think our problem is that our politics is too slow. Our change is too hard. I worry less between us zigzagging from one place to another than I worry about institutional roadblocks and gridlock in our inability to do things.
When you think about any of the bills that you're currently supporting, and that includes USICA and all of these other things that we're talking about, infrastructure, et cetera. We had this ProPublica story a couple of weeks ago where they identified that relative to the growth of net worth, which, as I've explained to my audience, that's not how we tax in the United States. We tax on realized gains. But it exposed that if you're making money from assets rather than labor, you can, until you realize those gains, have significant tax-free growth of one's net worth. Do you think that in the context of any bill that's designed to help workers, that we also need to be revisiting how we tax assets versus labor?
Yes, we need a wealth tax in this country. I mean, think about this, David. My district has $10 trillion of market value in the Bay Area for
Right.
companies. It's grown 35% in the Bay Area, $10 trillion. We ought to be taxing some of that. And a lot of those billionaires, frankly, would pay the tax. They won't oppose it. Instead, this bipartisan bill for infrastructure is going to fund it by raising the gas tax on to the index of inflation. So we're going to tax the working class who basically have to drive 40 minutes because they can't afford an apartment in San Francisco or in New York. So they are commuting as is, and we're going to put the burden on them to pay for infrastructure instead of on the tech billionaires and the multi-billionaires who produced all this wealth. It makes no sense.
So I don't know about you. I see an actual tax on wealth as so unlikely to pass in the next 4 years that I wonder how much it's even worth talking about it. But some of the Biden proposals on either capital gains or, there's other ideas that maybe are more politically feasible. How important do you think it is, as someone who's been advocating for the wealth tax and other things that, quite frankly, I think are unlikely to pass anytime soon? How much is the balance in your mind between trying to get something done that can actually be done versus talking about what you see as the gold standard?
Well, I think we can do both, David. I mean, Tom Suozzi, who's a moderate on Ways and Means, and Brendan Boyle have actually come out now for a wealth tax, a one-time wealth tax, not like more than 2% every year, but they said, let's call it the Patriot tax. With the pandemic, all this wealth that was generated, let's tax it one time. So that is because of people like you and Elizabeth Warren and others who have put the idea into the public discourse. And what often happens is it takes years and then finally something happens. So we need to continue to do that. But we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if we can get some solid reforms now, such as a step up in basis, means if you buy $1 million of Facebook stock, you hold it till the end of your life. If you one day have kids and you give it to your kids, they should have to pay tax on the capital gains. Right now, they don't have to. Literally, you can die with capital gains never having been taxed and pass it on to your heirs. Biden closes that gap and it raises billions of dollars. We ought to be increasing the tax on corporations. So let's get those done. But ultimately, if you really want to fund things in this country, we need a Wall Street financial tax. We need a wealth tax. And I don't think that will hurt innovation or economic growth, but it would fund the basic infrastructure based on the people who have made fortunes, inconceivable fortunes.
Yeah, there's some pretty slick stuff. And I don't know if by slick, I even mean this sarcastically or not. I mean, it's interesting to me that this can be done. One can even, to build on the idea of the stepped up basis, one can even borrow against their portfolio and, in a sense, de facto realize the gains. Like, you can actually get access to that growth without even having to pay the capital gains and pass it on tax free. I mean, that's quite a mechanism that exists in the United States tax code.
It is, and David, and trust me that it's all being used by these billionaires who are hiring lawyers. And, in one sense, you can't blame them. I mean, they're taking advantage of rules that Congress has written. So they could be more patriotic perhaps and pay tax, but how many people are going to say, I want to pay more tax than I owe?
Right.
So what we really need to do is change the rules, make sure that these billionaires who produce all of this wealth are being taxed fairly on it. And I don't think a billionaire sitting there is going to think, okay, maybe I shouldn't, or an aspiring billionaire, I'm not going to start the next Google because the government may take 2% of my net worth. That's just not how entrepreneurs think.
How do you see the sort of tiering of priorities when it comes to the financial stuff? And what I mean by that is, sometimes I talk to people who are on the left who I think feel pressure to say, basically, once you're making a couple $100,000 a year or even $500,000 a year, that and making 10 million and 100 million and $1 billion, it should really be seen in the same way. You're just making a ton of money. And when I actually get into it with a lot of people, we sort of get to realize that, there's a big difference between making $350K with a couple kids in a big city versus people who are making $5, $50, and $500 million a year. How important do you think it is to approach those groups differently versus just wrap everybody together?
It's very important to approach them differently because the real taxes have to be on the ultra rich and the big corporations. And that's where the real money is. And tax the people who are making billions of dollars, some of it perhaps legitimately. Look, they may have come up with a great idea. They see the digital revolution.
Sure.
They understand it's transforming an industry. They're at the forefront of leading that. Great. celebrate it, but then they have to pay a tax so that society can transition. But that's where the real tax is. Don't go after the person who's making a few $100,000, already has a couple kids in college in the suburbs. I mean, look, make sure it goes up to 39%, but that's not, you don't want to sock the middle class or even the upper middle class. You want to do is say, we're going to prioritize the working class. We're going to look out for the middle class and upper middle class, but we're really going to get the revenue from the big corporations and the ultra rich.
And I think maybe this is something that the truly ultra rich really benefit from, which is that when they are sort of wrapped in together with folks that are wealthy but less wealthy, they are maybe better able to take advantage of the tax law and end up paying as an effective tax rate even less. Like the ultra rich often end up paying slightly less than the very rich, to distinguish between two very rich groups. That maybe is something that would deserve some significant attention.
Absolutely. I think we have to treat the ultra rich as a separate class, given the wealth generation in this country. And I think taxing them more, in my view, is in their interest. And this is why there's so many billionaires, by the way, in my district who are fine with a wealth tax.
Yep.
And the reason it's in their interest is because if you want to prevent a resentment, a hostility to wealth generation, and a lot of their wealth generation, in my view, has come through honest, hard work, creativity, and ingenuity. It's not that they deserve all of the billions. There are lots of people that went into it, but it's not that they were just, lucky. They did work hard. But if you want people to celebrate that, then pay the tax and show that you're generating that wealth is helping society. When you don't pay that tax, that's where you have the resentment.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about, in terms of budget reconciliation, where would you like to see it used in order to get one more big accomplishment in 2021?
Climate. Clearly, it has to have climate in it. I mean, the infrastructure plan that currently is on the table is basically a version of what Trump had. It has none of the climate goals. So we need the climate goals in there. We need a broader vision on tax policy so that you don't have the working class hit with the tax policy. That would be my essential part. I mean, obviously, I want to expand Medicare. I want prescription drugs. I have a whole child care, a whole vision. But if the White House were to call me and said, what are the must-haves, I'd say good tax policy and climate.
Do you agree that for Democrats to make a solid case for 2022, which really is going to kick off, I mean, it might be January, it really might even be November, December, some consultants are saying. Do you think that Joe Biden needs one more major accomplishment in addition to vaccine rollout and COVID stimulus this calendar year?
I do, and I think he'll get one, but the question is, what kind will it be? If it is just a bipartisan infrastructure bill, that may help, and it may help in moderate swing districts, but I don't think it's going to mobilize our base, and we need both. We need something for the independent swing voters, but we also need to show our base that we really delivered on progressive change. So I would say he needs one big thing that appeals to the base as well.
Yeah, a relatively small infrastructure bill that Mitt Romney loves. I don't know if that's necessarily going to count as the progressive change people are waiting for. Completely agree with you. We've been speaking with Congressman Ro Khanna, representing California's 17th district. Always great having you on.
David, I always enjoy it. Thank you.